am really pleased to be here today at Firebuyer Live. I'm Andrea White, and the topic I wanted to cover in the next 20 minutes or so is how we might improve decision making in the fire sector. So, why have I chosen this topic? Well, I'm a fire engineer and I spend a lot of my time working in design teams, helping with the fire safety aspects of a building. I also do a fair amount of dispute resolution work, liaising with regulators and clients to come up with fire safety solutions that are acceptable to all parties. And then finally, I also volunteer on various committees and working groups. I'll also say that I spent 5 years working in a county fire service, working in fire safety enforcement and also training as a retained firefighter. So I'm able to draw on that experience of fire service culture as well, which I think is really helpful given today's audience. And in all those roles, I'm really keen to watch how decision making occurs within the various groups that I'm part of. What are the dynamics? What makes the productive discussions? And what simply doesn't? So let's dive in with the first of my 4 suggestions around better decision making in the fire sector. So, number 1. Who is in your decision-making group? If you look around your decision-making table, are you considering whether you have the right people there? Have you considered whether those in the decision-making circle offer diversity of thought? What do I mean by those questions? Well, firstly, I appreciate that this might sound like a very simple and obvious question, but do you have the right expertise round the table? Are you tapping into the best skill sets on this subject that are at your disposal? And irrespective of where they might be within the organisation even. Because logically it follows that if you have your most knowledgeable people involved, then the quality of the potential solutions should be better. But sometimes we overlook people, don't we? Maybe because they aren't the right grade or they aren't the right rank, or simply we don't know that they've got that level of skill. And in my view, I think that's a vital question to be asking to ensure that we give ourselves the best opportunity to make quality decisions. Who have we got around that decision-making table? Now, closely aligned with this idea of expertise is diversity of thought. And in his insightful book on leadership called Turn the Ship Around, retired US Navy Captain David Marquette says about those involved in decision making, if everyone thinks like you don't need them. And I think he's got a good point here. If everyone round the table has the same ideas, the same experiences and the same viewpoint, then what we're creating is an echo chamber, isn't it? Where we can all agree and congratulate each other on what we all think is a great idea. Here's an image which I think really illustrates this point very well, with the question being put to the interviewee, describe what you bring to this company. And this very clearly illustrates, doesn't it, the concept of diversity of thought, the concept that's been proved by research to result in better quality decisions. If we bring together different experiences, different perspectives, different ideas, research has shown that we will end up with better quality and more robust decisions. However, there are some caveats, which brings me nicely on to point number 2. Point number 2 is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand, use and manage your own emotions and to understand and respond to the emotions of other people too. If we can manage our emotions around the decision-making table, then we can have more productive discussions, and that should lead to better quality and more robust decisions. Here's an image about emotional intelligence, and you can see here there are 5 components of emotional intelligence. There's motivation, there's empathy, there's social skills, self-awareness, and finally self-regulation. Now, in terms of emotional intelligence, it's really helpful if individual members of the decision-making group have emotional intelligence. But what's crucial is that the individual who's chairing or running or in charge of the group has emotional intelligence and can manage that group appropriately. Let me give you 2 examples of why it's important that those in charge of the decision-making process have emotional intelligence that I think you might be able to relate to. The first is psychological safety. Can you offer your opinion in that decision-making group? Can you disagree with your colleagues and your leader without fear of victimisation or other repercussions? Put simply, is it okay to challenge? Is challenge even welcomed? This is important because we know from research that constructive criticism and challenge produce better quality and more robust decisions. But if we've gone to the trouble of ensuring that the right expertise is round the table, that's all in vain if people are fearful about saying what they really think, or if they aren't actively encouraged to speak up and voice concerns or comments. When we're in discussions round the table, it's certainly a better time to be thinking about potential issues than finding out the flaws in our plan during implementation, because no one is willing or feels safe enough to say anything. This image by Paul Coombs illustrates my point. When someone closes a meeting with any questions, do they really mean it, or are they just saying it? To devise the best decisions, what we really need is to encourage a questioning attitude over blind obedience. And then my second point around emotional intelligence comes from a great book by Marianne Siegert called The Authority Gap. And it's the point that confidence does not equal competence. Let me say that again. Confidence does not equal competence. Confidence is not the same as competence. They are utterly different things, aren't they? But it can be really easy to mistake confidence for competence if we aren't careful. We can all think of people who are supremely confident, and that is a great attribute. But confidence is not the same as competence, and we need to be careful to use our emotional intelligence and ascertain who is competent and use their views and opinions to inform decision making, rather than allowing the most confident individuals to voice their opinions despite them having perhaps less relevant expertise. In this regard, we will generally find that girls and women, on the whole, are less confident than boys and men. And this tends to be because of social conditioning, which happens from birth. Girls are taught to be modest and self-deprecating, while in almost all cultures, boys are taught to be competitive and confident. Girls and women who go against this social norm are punished for being assertive or decisive or a leader. And as Marianne Siegert says in her book, nobody likes a boastful woman. So if we know that boys and men are more likely to overestimate their ability and girls and women are more likely to underestimate theirs, do we need to allow for this as leaders within decision-making groups? Do we need to make sure that those who are competent, irrespective of their gender, are encouraged to speak up and have their say? I think this is definitely something that in our male-dominated fire sector we need to factor into our decision-making processes more. Let's move on to point number 3. My third point is around listening. I've just talked about ensuring that we have the right expertise around the decision-making table and that we ensure we create an environment where people feel they can put their point of view across without recrimination. But what happens to those great pieces of insight if no one hears them? Often, rather than listening to what others have to say, what we're actually doing is formulating how we're going to put our next point across. And in that scenario, we might miss out on the great information that we're being offered. Or what if the meeting is hijacked by only a few individuals, all keen to be heard? Are we hearing only the potentially valuable contributions, or are we being forced to listen to those who speak loudest? I'll say it again. Competence and confidence are different things. If we dismiss new or out-of-the-box thinking in favour of the idiom, no, we've always done it this way, I suggest to you that we're missing out on new perspectives that might give us better quality and more robust decisions. Here's another image by Paul Coombs which depicts just this issue. Nelson Mandela was always the last person to speak during a meeting. Why was that? Because he wanted to hear what others had to say before they heard and were potentially influenced by what he had to say. Where we create a supportive environment where people feel encouraged to offer their ideas, and then we actively listen to those ideas, we give the group the best opportunity for success, to succeed in making quality decisions which are robust and resilient. So on to my final point, which is about unconscious bias. Unconscious or implicit biases are prejudices that affect our decision making, and they're based on our attitudes, our beliefs, and our past experiences. And as the term unconscious bias implies, we may well not realise that they're affecting our decisions. Now, it's important to say we all have unconscious biases, every single one of us. But if we can become more conscious of our biases and realise where they aren't serving us, then we can improve the quality of our decision making. Let me give you an example. The example is some research, an experiment that involved an expert giving information about how to survive in a bushfire. Men and women were put into small groups with one expert designated in each group. The researchers measured how influential each person was by how much they converted the group to their point of view. The research showed that women were less influential within their groups than men. But surprisingly, the female experts were perceived to be less expert and were less influential than female non-experts. Meanwhile, the male experts were significantly more influential than the male non-experts. This is a classic case of unconscious bias. The experts often had to disagree with others during those group discussions about how to act in a bushfire in order to persuade people of their case. If the expert was a woman, this did not go down well. People felt uncomfortable. They didn't like women challenging and disagreeing with others. But interestingly, they were happy for men to do the same. The female non-experts, meanwhile, tended to agree with the group, which meant they were rated as more competent, more likeable, and therefore more influential than the female experts. So what does this demonstrate? Well, it demonstrates that women who challenge have a really hard time and face pushback even when they are the expert in the room. Even then, they are likely to be resisted as leaders or agents of influence, and that can potentially have a significant impact on quality decision making. This is an example of gender bias, but there are lots of other types of unconscious bias. If our goal is to make the best decisions we can, then we need to be aware and challenge our unconscious biases, because they're potentially preventing us from accessing the best quality information on which to base our decisions. So let me conclude. My topic today has been how we might improve decision making in the fire sector. It's drawn on inspiration from these two excellent books on leadership and psychology. One is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette, and the other is The Authority Gap by Marianne Ziegert. And I've made 4 suggestions today. Number 1, think about who is in your decision-making group. Have you got the right people there? The people who have the right expertise. A decision-making group makes the best decisions when it constructively challenges and questions the ideas put forward, so that it can make better quality decisions, which are more robust or resilient. Number 2, think about emotional intelligence. Are those around the table understanding, using, and managing their own emotions, and understanding and responding appropriately to the emotions of others? The more productive our discussions, the better quality our decisions will be. If the decision-making table isn't somewhere that people feel they can speak up, then we're not going to get the best quality decisions. Remember that image earlier where managers say they want feedback, but do they really mean it? And remember that competence and confidence are 2 completely different things. We're looking to bring out competent insights rather than solely focusing on those who are most confident at voicing their opinions. Number 3, let's make sure we're listening. Let's make sure everyone's contribution is heard. Let's make sure everyone's contribution is encouraged and valued. And lastly, I hope you'll go away today and reflect on your unconscious biases, because we all have them. I've lost count of how many times it's been assumed that the fire engineer on a design project is male, and then I appear at a meeting. What we're trying to do is make the best quality decisions we can, aren't we? And to do that, we need the best expertise. We need people to speak up, and we need to hear their comments, no matter what form those comments might come in. I'm Andrea White. I'm an independent fire engineer working in the UK, and I'm also founder of Women Talking Fire, which is an independent networking and support group for women and male allies in the UK fire safety industry. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much for watching today.
Well, thank you, Andrea, for giving us another fantastic session and for giving us your insights today. Today, obviously, you focus on decision-making in the fire sector. And I loved in particular when you spoke about how confidence does not equal competence. That's a great title. So some very wise words there. You've obviously had an incredibly extensive career and are very influential in your field. So it's always a privilege to have you here. I was wondering whether you would be able to point out a specific moment or experience that you've perhaps endured over your career that has prompted you to want to speak about this topic.
Yeah, maybe not one specific instance. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I wanted to talk on this topic today, because it's something that I see fairly regularly. And I think, what we're trying to do is make best use of our time and make quality decisions. And I think, when I reflect on being in meetings, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, we get very caught up in a detail, or we suffer from some of these things that I've talked about today. And I think, there's a real opportunity to have more productive discussions and make better decisions.
100% agree. And also, it's not just, obviously, we focus primarily today on kind of different gender characteristics, I suppose. But it goes, it goes a lot further than that. If you suffer from I don't know, a mental disability, for example, there's lots of different traits as to why somebody might not feel as confident to be able to speak up in a meeting, and they've got to be taken into consideration, definitely. So some really important points, covered today. I'm going to throw a slight curveball at you with a slightly difficult question. But you spoke about kind of the inclusivity and diversity of a workforce around that decision-making table. But how can we help ensure that we can get all of these different types of people that have competency to even have a seat at the table?
That's a really good question. I think it comes down to those who are organising those groups actually stopping and thinking beforehand. I mean, it's the old fail to prepare, prepare to fail, isn't it? And I think that there's a lot to be said for preparing for meetings and actually thinking about who you want to invite to the table, and researching who those best people are, because in my experience, they're not always apparent to you. And I think, unless you do that, you've almost kneecapped yourself in the decision-making process by not utilizing your best resources in that activity. So I think for me, it's whoever's running the group. It's their responsibility to sort of take a step back before any meetings happen and actually consider who needs to be involved. And I think what we need to be really careful of is having meetings where actually there's lots of individuals, but when who perhaps have expertise in a more general area, but who might not have expertise in that specific that you're actually talking about. I mean, I certainly know that instances where we've been guilty of that. What do they say? Nothing for us without us. So, something like disability, if you're talking about fire safety and disability, how many people around that decision-making table actually have experience of disability, as well as having some expertise in fire safety? And that sounds like a really basic question and should be really obvious. But even at that level, I'm not sure that's happening. I'm not sure that we're thinking that way right now.
No, definitely. And I think that's also where the whole kind of unconscious and conscious bias comes in as well. If you're leading that meeting and deciding who to invite, that's your perfect opportunity to actually check yourself, I suppose, to make sure that you're not accidentally, or purposely, leaving anyone out. So I think they kind of come hand in hand, and it's about getting into the routine and the habitual side of just going, do I go through a list of every single person in this department or in this business, and then decide from there, rather than just going, oh, let's just invite the usual people. It's about making it, part of that routine. And I think the other thing you said as well is the note, we have always done it this way. And that has got to be one of the most common phrases that I'm sure absolutely everyone here can relate to. So if I'm interested to know if somebody who is competent and perhaps quieter by nature, who is also, a lower rank in a business of the decision making, if they're facing that phrase from their line manager or boss or whatever, when they're trying to offer their insight, what would you recommend that they do?
Yeah, I mean, I think based on my experience, I can certainly remember earlier in my career, I might have got frustrated by that. And maybe my passion and my enthusiasm, wasn't necessarily coming across as a positive thing. And I think one thing that you can do is use emotional intelligence and actually almost view it as some sort of game. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but that there's a lot to be said for influencing. So actually having conversations with people outside of those meetings so that you've got some allies during the meeting and that you can have those conversations and put your points across with people prior to having that group discussion, so that you're more likely to have people back your point of view, that suddenly you're not quite so alone. And maybe you need people to encourage you or support you or reinforce your point. But it's definitely about being strategic, I would say.
No, definitely. Funny you say that. Actually, I was recording a panel session the other day, and somebody was explaining to me when they're getting a code of practice into to get accepted by government anyway, and they were saying that initially they went in and the House of Lords or whatever went, no, we this is what we're going to do, we've already made this decision, despite any of them having any of the competence or technological ability or knowledge on the specific technology in at the time. So I'm being very vague with this, and rather than going, oh well, whatever then, instead they drafted their own kind of code of practice, brought in the experts and then presented it to them, and they went, oh, actually you might have a point here. So sometimes it just take that kind of level-headed type of, it's very easy when you're faced with those scenarios to kind of get very worked up, get very angered by them, because I'm sure you'll relate, but we face it quite a lot. So it's very, sometimes, you like you said, you unfortunately have to play a little game sometimes, but in a good way, and make sure your voice is still heard. But anyway, I think that's all we have time for today. But as always, I've learned a lot from your session and from talking with you, Andrea. So thank you. Always appreciate your time. If anybody is interested in seeing Andrea's previous Fire by Live sessions, you can catch them on our on-demand section of the platform. And if you have any questions, please do connect with Andrea directly or on the platform, or with the Women Talking Fire exhibitor booth. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rebecca.